today we are really lucky to have Dr. Frederic Bertley. He is respected as one of the premier science, technology, engineering, and math, that's that acronym STEM we hear a lot, education leaders in the industry. He previously served as the Senior Vice President for Science and Education at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, where he engaged diverse communities in STEM topics through proactive outreach and inspired programming. He's recognized both nationally and internationally as a thought leader in the fields of applied science, science education, and community engagement. Dr. Bertley has an extraordinary and equally infectious, and you'll see this here in a few minutes, passion for science, literacy, and advocacy. He's originally from Canada. He has a bachelor's degree in physiology and mathematics and a PhD in immunology from McGill University in Montreal. He served as a research fellow in the development of an HIV vaccine while at the Harvard University Medical School and Children's Hospital in Boston. Dr. Frederic is COSI's new president and CEO. COSI was founded in 1964, has 135 full-time employees, and over 10,000 volunteers. The annual budget's about $17 million, and COSI hosted over 670,000 visitors last year. That's pretty impressive. So, I will submit to you his task is not easy as our new CEO because he's being asked to improve on a science museum that is already nationally renowned and consistently winning accolades, such as it was honored as a top 5 science museum in the United States in 2015 by Family Fun magazine. It was named a 10 Best Museum for Families by USA Today and was recognized as America's #1 science center for families by Parents magazine. That's pretty impressive, just to name a few of our accolades. But there's some fun facts about Frederic that probably aren't out there on the internet that I thought I would just share with you.
Here we go. You know I'm on the mic after you.
I know. He tells people that he is the Oops baby's younger brother. I'll let you think about that for a second. He's the Oops baby's younger brother. He has thrown out a first pitch at a Philadelphia Phillies baseball game. Did you get it over? How many bounces? Got it over? All right. He likes to skydive, and his biggest surprise in moving to Columbus has been our food. Apparently, he and his wife have been eating their way through the city, but he chickened out when it came to the Terminator hamburger. He did not do it. Fellow Rotarians, help me welcome Dr. Frederic Bertley to Columbus Rotary.
Mike, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I was cringing. I wasn't sure where you were going to go with that, but I can take all of that. Thank you. Paul and fellow Rotarians, thank you very much for having me here to speak today. It's a distinguished pleasure. I do want to give one special thank you, and I appreciate you called out the table of COSI supporters, but one person there wasn't called out, and that's Bob Weiler. I just want to thank you. He's been a huge supporter for COSI for about 30, 40 years or so, so thank you for that. So I'm going to direct you to the slides and try to go through this for about 20, 25 minutes or so and then take some questions. I want to begin with this. So, and I will not speak in Russian or Czech, so I appreciate your language. But and real quick, if you were watching me when we were doing the pledge, you might have noticed everybody directed to the U.S. flag, and I was a little slow to get over there. That's my Canadian upbringing, but finally I got there. So, all right, but I want to start with this. This is where it all began. This is me. This is the days when I can actually grow hair. And the question is, how did I go from that to being a scientist, right? It's all about science, innovation, and inspiration. And so it all began with that. Does anybody recognize that in the audience? Right? All right. So for those of you who have children and grandchildren, you don't recognize that. That's kind of the old school version of the modern day handheld game that kids have today. And that's how I got into science. I was raised by West Indian parents, and they let me have a paper route. But if you know West Indians, even though you have the paper route, it's not really your money. You have to put it all in the bank. You can barely spend it. But finally, I begged them when this came out. I said, please let me buy this game. And they finally let me buy the game. And I bought it and took these square 9-volt batteries. But the problem was, back then, the electronics weren't very efficient, and so it would chew through the battery. I'm a little kid with a paper route. I couldn't afford to buy many batteries. So I had this, what I thought was an ingenious idea. Went downstairs into the basement, found an old lamp my dad had, cut the cable of the lamp, opened up the back of the video game, there's that red and black wire, attached that to the cable, plugged it into the wall. Best 10 seconds of my life. I was sitting there playing, and I remember this like it was yesterday. I was about 9 years old. I remember thinking, wow, I'm going to play this before school. I'm going to play it after school. I thought I resolved the problems. By the 11th second, poof, it exploded, and the wall was charred. And my dad, who's from Trinidad, comes barreling down the stairs, and he's like, son, what are you doing? You're trying to burn down the house. But what was fascinating about that experience is, for the first time, I had my aha moment. And I realized that, wow, this thing we call electricity is way more complex than plugging something in a wall or clicking a switch. And that's what got me hooked on science, and that's what got me kind of where I am today. So you heard some of my CV. Professionally, I was part of an HIV vaccine group at Harvard Medical School. But then, for you lawyers out there, I actually had a stint at a great law firm called Hale & Dorr, which later became Wilmer Hale, out in Boston, working in intellectual property. So I left the bench, learned some business skill sets, doing patent prosecution, copyright, trademark. But really, the passion that weaves through my marrow is education. And so through different ways, different times in my career, I've taught at almost every level, from elementary to high school to Roxbury Community College, which is just the toughest community college in the country, frankly, all the way to Harvard Medical School, teaching their first-year kids in immunology. So education was really my passion. And that led me to the Franklin Institute, which is a science center in Philadelphia. It's much like COSI. It's the oldest science center in the country. And it's also where the National Memorial is to Benjamin Franklin. So when you think of the national memorials, you think of the Washington Plaza, you have Lincoln, Jefferson, the Washington Monument, and then, of course, they have Martin Luther King one. The only one that's not there is in Philadelphia, and that's right there in the atrium of the Franklin Institute, of course, in honor of Benjamin Franklin. But what's interesting is the address of the Franklin Institute's 222 North 20th Street, the Franklin Institute. Well, I moved to COSI, which is 333 West Broad Street, the Franklin Board of Trade. And COSI is only the doing business name. And so clearly I'm moving on up like the Jeffersons, right? But really, this led me to COSI. And so I like to talk about kind of from Franklin to Franklinton. And with that, I want to pause and collect some data. As was mentioned, I'm a scientist. Is it okay if I collect a little data from the audience? Oh, okay, great. So a few questions. One, how many of you have texted today? Okay, in the front, all the hands are up at the back. How many of you have had a prescription from the doctor in the last 4 years? All right. How many of you share photos electronically? Again, all the hands are going up. How many of you eat food? Right? And how many of you are sitting in this building? Right? So it sounds funny, but the point here is, in the 21st century, we are completely surrounded by science and technology. And if you don't think that's true, see if you can wake up tomorrow morning and get through the day without specifically being impacted by science and technology. I mean, most of us roll out of bed, we grab our phone to see what our president tweeted or find the weather or what have you. I mean, the food we eat's genetically modified, the clothes, you talked about your closet, those fraternity shirts you were talking about. Material scientists have spent billions of dollars trying to figure out how to make these things stain resistant. GPS, you name it, it's all around us. We really are in a science and technology world. So the question is, where do we go from here, right? Well, you've heard the terms science, technology, engineering, and math. And what's fascinating is there's some really cool advances that I just want to share with you in terms of really grounding you all for where science and engineering has taken us. So if you like cars, here's a fancy, expensive Italian sports car. Well, there's a new kind of car being developed. Here's a car developed by some colleagues at the MIT Media Lab. That's a drawing of it. Here's another drawing of it. The car actually folds up and can seat 2 full-grown adults. You get in your car, here are actual prototypes, you take your car out, you check it out like a grocery cart. There's no license plates, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You go to a stand, you check it out like a grocery cart, you sit down in it, it can go up to about 40 miles an hour, get you where you need to go, low pollution, low traffic, 100% electric, and really cool. All right, anybody know who this gentleman is? He's the nation's greatest engineer right now. It's Dean Kamen. You all know the Segway. He invented that. But he has over 440 patents, really innovative things, including those black boxes there that are called Slingshot. Those black boxes make purified, drinkable water out of any liquid source. Use your imagination. I get little kids who ask me, you mean pee-pee, Dr. B? Yes, even pee-pee. It's a patented process and makes purified drinking water. Now, for us in the U.S., we don't really worry about that, except maybe in California and Flint. But we have the luxury of going home and turning it. That was my one joke, folks. Okay. We have the luxury of going home, turning on the tap. You can drink the water, shower. Well, 2/3 of the world does not have access to drinkable water. And what's shocking is 50% of mortality, 50% of the deaths that happen on our planet happen to people because they literally do not have access to clean water. So Dean Kamen and his slingshots being tested in about 5 villages all around the world, bringing clean water to populations that used to have to hike 6 or 8 hours for a bucket of dirty water. Unbelievable. I'm a life scientist, so I want to talk a little bit about some cool things in genomics. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah, you remember the name of the movie? Finding Nemo, right? So I got some good news and some bad news. What would you like first? Okay, well, you guys, you've heard this talk before. No, this is great. So the good news, I'll give you the good news first. The good news is we found Nemo, right? And as biologists, what do? Well, we pulled out the DNA, the genetic material of Nemo. By the way, this is a true story, right? Then we cloned it, meaning we made copies of it. The way you do that is you put inside bacteria, the bacteria replicate, you pull out the DNA, you got the sequences you need. Then, anybody know what we did with the DNA sequence of Nemo? Any guesses? Put it in a tomato. Now you guys might be like, Dr. B, you're crazy. What do you? Somebody mentioned something about acid, I think, in the earlier remarks. No, I did not have any acid. They really put it in a tomato. So I told a little fib. It wasn't really Nemo, but it was a fish. In fact, it's a Canadian Arctic whitefish, right? You and I, if we fall in the Arctic Ocean, we'll die. We have about 15 minutes, but our bodies can't thermoregulate. We can't handle that very cold temperature. But there are wildlife that can. Polar bears is one example, and the Canadian Arctic whitefish. So scientists pulled out the gene, the DNA sequence that's responsible for allowing that fish to handle that cold temperature, and they transfected it into a tomato. Because if you're a tomato farmer, you know that you could spend 3 or 4 months growing your crops, and you get that 1 or 2 frost night in late September, early October, and you lose everything. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to genetically modified organisms. This is just one example. And I'm not saying it's bad or good. Personally, as a life scientist, I tell you it holds so much promise, but we can have that debate later. Lastly, what about the field of robotics, right? If you don't think you've been impacted by robotics, if you drive a car, unless it's a Bentley or an expensive Ferrari or a Lamborghini, it has been put together by a robot. If you've ordered anything on Amazon, it came to you from a robot. You've sent in your message either on your phone or on a computer. It goes to another computer, tells a robot that goes down the aisle, picks off a box, brings it to another robot, wraps the box, brings it to a third robot, puts the sticker with your address, gets to your house. You probably didn't even touch a person, right? Robots have been around us all the time. But there's a new kind of robot that's happening. This is an engineer from Queensland University in Australia. He's created these 2 robots. And what they do is when he turns them on, they learn to crawl like a baby. They then learn to stand up and balance. They then learn to recognize each other. And then they actually develop a language. Now, this is unbelievable. And I want to be clear here. We're not talking about programming it to speak Italian, Swahili, or German. We've been programming computers for years to translate languages. If you ever use Google Translate, for example, that's a perfect example of that. I'm talking about de novo, brand new language. Now, if that doesn't scare you, or at least think it's interesting, that's what separates humans from almost every other species. The fact that we've created an evolved way of communicating. And not only did they learn to communicate, they actually taught the scientists and engineers in their lab how to communicate with this foreign language. Unbelievable stuff. All right, so that doesn't scare you. When you think about Terminator, the next generation, it's things we need to think about when we talk about artificial intelligence and augmented reality. All right, with that, I hope to have convinced you we really are in a high-tech society. So when you think about jobs, we're all interested in the economy. This is from the Brookings Institute, and I had the pleasure of meeting with some folks last Friday from the Brookings Institute, and they were talking about a bunch of things. But here's some data where they talk about the plethora of science and engineering opportunities out there because of the 21st century we live in. In fact, if you look at, by the year 2020, 50%, half of the jobs in this country, half, or more are directly or peripherally related to science. Right? So unbelievable. Here's just a slide that tells you here's all the different things you can do with just an undergraduate degree in biology. Here's another slide showing you the various disciplines in engineering. So, if that's the case, let's look at a few other facts. Science and technology, how they're changing our world. The top 10 jobs today in technology didn't even exist 10 years ago. Imagine that. You think of the Rockefellers and the oil industry or automotive, these jobs are around forever. The top 10 technology jobs weren't even around 10 years ago. For those of you that have students in college, here's some sobering data. For students starting a 4-year technical degree in 2017, half of what they learned their first year will be obsolete by the third. Right? Talk about that, how fast technology is changing our lives. 3, Apple earns greater than 75% of its revenue from the iPhone and iPad. This is technology that did not even exist in 2007. And lastly, at 1.7 billion users, Facebook would actually rank as the world's largest country. And if you think about how people are communicating, they're communicating through the platform of Facebook and other social media. All right? And here's just a graph again showing you how jobs are increasing related to science, technology, engineering, and math. And here's a quote from our past president, President Barack Obama. Science is more than a school subject or the periodic table or the properties. It's actually an approach to the world, a critical way to understand and explore and engage with the world, and then have, and I'm dating myself for my age because I can barely see that, and then have the capacity to change the world. I mean, this is really what science offers us. So, if STEM is everywhere, if science, technology, engineering, math are everywhere, if innovation is really cool and there's a ton of careers, what's the problem? Well, there are 2 main problems. Problem number 1, the first public school in the US is called Boston Latin. It's actually still there, started in 1635. 1 year later, Harvard College was established to take the people from Boston Latin and continue their education, all right? This kind of is what it looked like. All right, here's a shot of Boston Latin. This is circa 1820-something. So this is a real picture of Boston Latin class. What do you all notice? Those of you in the front who can see this, what do you notice? Uniforms. It's all boys. All boys. So they fixed that a little later. They created a school called Girls Latin. What else do you notice? If you can, for those of you at the back, you can't see this. Look at the faces on the boys. How do they look? Not happy, right? It was painful. But you had these 2 people at the back. They were like wizards. These were the teachers. And they had all this knowledge and information in their head. And they'd sit there in the morning, throughout the whole day, and they'd tell you all kinds of stuff. You had your little chalkboard or whatever way you were recording the information. You recorded it, and then at the end of the week or at the end of 2 weeks, you had a test. Everything you memorized, you regurgitated back, and that's how you moved forward. And that made sense because that's how you communicated back then, right? Someone had the knowledge, they gave it to you, and then you continued on. Right? Here's a typical shot of a classic classroom across this country today. And what do you notice? The chairs are empty. Students aren't there because this is where they are. Right? So when you think about transportation, when is the last time you used a horse and carriage to go to work? Show of hands. Right? When is the last time you communicated with a cup or string or telegraph? Or even an old telephone? Right? When is the last time you used an abacus to do your calculations? Right? Every aspect of the world has moved forward. How we communicate. Right? How we drive or how we get around to work. The foods we eat, how they're agriculturally grown and how we process them. Absolutely everything has moved forward except for the typical classroom in this country. Now, let me be clear. There are some fantastic schools in the United States of America and Canada, but the bulk of public schools still look like that. Old school desks and chairs, students who are disconnected because there's a new level of acquiring or a new mechanism of acquiring information. The second big problem is, unfortunately, despite the fact that we're so dependent on technology, and technology is everywhere, we're living in a less and less science, technology, engineering, and math literate society, all right? So much so that there's been a ton of research by the American Association for Advancement of Science, Yale University.gov, but the National Science Foundation has really led this charge. They've researched the country coast to coast and looking at what is the state of science literacy. And while not true for anybody in this room, will you believe that 25% of Americans, 1/4 of Americans still believe that the sun revolves around the earth and the earth is the epicenter of the universe? This is true, all right? Talk about climate change. Here's a fun cartoon that says one elf speaking to Santa. The jury's still out on climate change as, the polar ice caps are melting. We're getting better here. 69% of Americans believe climate change is a real thing. So we're getting better. Here's on top, you're looking at viruses, and on the bottom, you're looking at bacteria. And I'm sure this has happened to at least one of you in the room. I know it's happened to me. You've gone to the doctor says, hey, Frederic, I think you have a viral infection. I'm like, okay, bummer. And then they give you a prescription, and the prescription is for an antibiotic. Now, this is a medical doctor. He or she went to medical school. And I can safely tell you that an antibiotic has zero use if indeed you have a viral infection. But this is happening. And this is a consequence of science illiteracy, even in some medical schools. But my favorite, especially with what's coming to COSI in November, is 41% of humans of Americans think that humans and dinosaurs coexisted. Now, this one I kind of get, and I give a pass. Why? I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so I watched a lot of Hanna-Barbera and Fred Flintstone. And those of you who know Fred Flintstone, you know he got into that car with no bottom, pushed his way to work, and when he got to work, what did he do? He went on the back of a dinosaur and he quarried, right? And so I give a little pass that I get kids can kind of grow up thinking that, but no, humans and dinosaurs did not coexist. So the point to all of this is, what do we need as a society? What do we need as a system? Well, we need a bunch of new ideas, and that's what brings me to COSI and excites me at COSI. Why? As a premier science center, we can do things way differently than your typical university or your typical internet series of informations or what have you. Because we have the capacity of making science, which often is touted as a very complex and difficult thing, make it digestible, make it fun, make it enjoyable, and make it accessible to everyone. So Ohio State is the big gun in this city. Clearly there are other great universities out there, but none of us will walk into Ohio State or Otterbein or Capitol to find out how a vaccine works or what are the things governing climate change, right? You're not going to get access to that, but you would come to something like COSI. And so how do we get people excited around science and engineering? We have fantastic exhibits. We currently have one called Be the Astronaut. We have great movies. Here's a Nat Geo film called Dream Big. We have another exhibit called Honda. But this fall we'll be opening dinosaurs. This is a partnership with the American Museum of Natural History. I'll tell you more about this in a minute. So the great Natural Sciences Institute in New York City, American Museum of Natural History, has partnered with us to bring two really cool things at COSI. One is a state-of-the-art dino gallery. That's a permanent gallery. And secondly, we'll have a traveling exhibit where we'll have some real great stuff curated by AM&H. But not only do we have these fantastic exhibits or movies, we do a lot of programming, what they call informal science, right? So we work with teachers, helping them be stronger and more able teachers in the classroom. We also work with youth, getting youth, especially underserved communities, exposed to different programs so that they too can think they can be a scientist. The most important thing to remember about a place like COSI is it's experiential, it's hands-on. Look how engaged these kids are on a very simple science project. Here's another thing. I mean, look at these young ladies, playing with robots. We have a program, though, for adults. I know a lot of times people think COSI and Science Museum are just for families or for kids. We have a program called COSI After Dark, and this is for 21 to 40. It started off 21 to 35, then it became 21 to 40-year-olds. Now it's 21 to 45-year-olds, and it's creeping up because people really like it. What do? It goes from 6 to 11 on any given night once a month. And we have our fantastic exhibits open, but then we bring in other really cool things. So cutting edge folks who are working in technology or augmented reality or virtual reality, they'll come in with their stations, with their lenses, and you can have this really great experience. But the key to bringing 21-year-olds to 45-year-olds is we also sell beer, wine, and we have a full bar. And so on any given night, we average about 800 to 1,000 people come out to this, and so it's really exciting. So those of you within that age range, and those of you who want to feel like you're within that age range, by all means, come on to COSI. But this is my favorite picture, because these are two young ladies experiencing COSI After Dark, and one of them is looking at the same scientific phenomena, and one of them is like, oh my gosh, that's really cool. And the other one's like, holy, right? I mean, just look at their face. And that's a fun thing about science, because there's something there for everyone, all right? So why do we do all this? When you talk about a picture being worth 1,000 words, this is the daughter of a friend of mine, all right? And you can just see her face. She is so enthralled with that butterfly. And this is from the butterfly exhibit at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. But That's the point, ladies and gentlemen. As children, we are all born curious. We all have the capacity to ask those tough questions and really transform the landscape and the world. But it's all based on our experiences and what we get, and that's where a place like COSI can really turn the light bulb on for kids. And the last point I want to talk about is not only are we a great science center, and I love some of the stats that you shared, so thanks so much, Mike. But we're also a cultural institution, and it's important to understand. A lot of times people say, oh, well, the art museum or the symphony, those are cultural institutions, but a science center, that's a science museum. Yeah, we're a science museum, that's our content, but it's all about really enriching people's lives, and so we are a cultural institution. And why is that important? Because here's a schematic of what's happening at the Scioto Peninsula. Right, and to give you another kind of aerial, you can see the water, the Scioto River there. You can see where COSI is. To the left, that curved building is actually the new National Veteran Memorial, and that stuff, all those white buildings along the base, they haven't broken ground yet. But the point is, those are mixed-use properties that will have businesses as well as housing and residences. But the point is, this is the epicenter of the new downtown, and COSI is part of that. And so I couldn't be more excited to be part of the great team to help lead COSI to its next generation, really through the lens of making people appreciate science by coming through COSI. Thank you very much. I am happy to take some questions.
How are we going to reinvigorate and change the educational system so that it is advanced?
I mean, that's a great question. And it's important. When I showed some of the data out there, it's not a Columbus thing. You can go to New Orleans, you can go to Oakland, you can go to Boston, Philly, New York. You go to any major city, and now, unfortunately, you go to rural areas, the public school system is in disarray. And you ask a really challenging question, how are we going to solve it? There's a lot of kind of big hand-wavy ideas of how to solve it, but one, it's going to take a lot of collaboration, a lot of cooperation, and two, it's going to take a lot of admitting. I mean, you know, the schools are absolutely boring. I mean, you know, I'll give you an example. Most kids, most adults, for example, if you ask them, do you like math? Oh, no, I don't like math. And then you show them a logarithmic equation, and then they really lose themselves. You know, oh, my gosh, I don't understand any of that. Yet I do this all the time. I go to kids, they can be 4 years old, 5 years old, 8 years old, and I say, how many of y'all want $1? You know, kids get all excited. I say, how many of y'all want $10? Then you see a few more hands go up. How many of y'all want $100? And then if I tell them, how many of y'all want $1,000? And I'll pull out, you know, about $100 in my pocket, but to the kids it looks like $1,000. Pull out, they're losing their mind. Oh my gosh, Dr. B, you're gonna give me $1,000. They absolutely, completely understand logarithmic expansion base 10. As do all of you, right? Yet none of them knew they understood that. And if you asked each of them, do you like math? Oh, I can't stand math, or I'm not smart, it's not for me. Why? Because we teach math in an antiquated, boring way that repels people. So if the school systems admit that they suck, pardon me, but that they need some work, and if the teachers, if we can find ways to better financially pay teachers so you're getting more investment by the teachers, you'll get better teachers, and then the curriculum will become more exciting, more engaging, and then you'll like it. I have not found a kid yet that's not enthralled with anything scientific. I mean, if they're 2 to 10, give them a robot, give them something scientific, give them a butterfly. Kids will be so excited. By the time they're 17, they're bored out of it or not interested because our systems aren't great. So it's a big question, but what excites me is being at a science center. Yes, we work with schools, and yes, we make sure some of our content, you know, is curriculum correlated and speaks to the right grades, but we're not bound by the rigid structures of schools. We can excite and teach people things in ways that we think are dynamic. So now everybody, now you know what logarithmic expansion works. All right? Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Since you had questions for us, we have a question for you. Do you know who Roy Schaefer is?
Absolutely. He's one of my predecessors' predecessor.
Yes. He was a ColumbusRotarian and a past president.
That
I'd like
you
you to
go.
follow his footsteps and join our club.
I am humbled by that invitation. I was invited already by your great president, but and someone else, in fact. But absolutely, I accept. Let me know how to proceed. But thank you very much. And Roy was a great person. So thank you. Yes, sir.
Are you doing any studies on the people who actually come visit COSI in terms of age, sex, whatever it is that you want to track or find out?
I'm convinced he's tapped my office, because that's a great question, and we're doing almost exactly that. So first of all, we do track our audiences over the years. So we know the age, demographics, the sex, the zip codes, where they come from. Now, a lot of that's based on voluntary information. The person has to give us their zip code and give us the information. But we do have a good sense of who our demographic is. But because of this really exciting project we're doing with the American Museum of Natural History, and we're bringing dinosaurs here, we want to knock it out the park. We want to make sure we really increase foot traffic as significantly as possible. To that end, we're doing right now a pricing study that's giving us a combination of what should we set ticket price, because that's always an issue with this new great content from American Museum of Natural History. But a second component to this test is who is coming to COSI, and more importantly, who is not coming in about 100 to 150 mile radius. So figuring out that through surveys and intercepts, etc. So great question. Yes, we're working on it. I have a board meeting tomorrow, and my board chairs. I have a board meeting on Thursday, and my board chair is here. We're going to talk about it, but we're getting the results, I think, on Wednesday. So we'll have a quick window into it. Yes, way at the back. Thank you for that question, and that's a great question and a problem, if you will, not just for COSI, but museums in general, but definitely science museums within this country. Parents come with their kids, they explore, they get excited. But what's interesting, and what happens when the kids turn 12, 13, or 14-ish? Somebody said it. With two things, puberty and video games. No, this is a true story. And so what happens is, you then, by the time they become a young teenager or adolescent and teenager and then late teenager, they are bombarded with hormones. So they're redirected, from a neuroscience standpoint, thinking about different things. And two, it's all about being cool and hip. And so to your question, how do we as science centers in particular, in this case, how do we as COSI stay very relevant and even cool and exciting for that 13 to 19-year-old cohort? So we started with COSI After Dark, because we also had that same problem with the 21 to 35-year-olds. If you're 21 to 35 and you don't have kids, you're probably not going to Science Museum. Well, now they're coming to COSI because we've made it hip for that group. So we're definitely thinking about how to do that. We do have success with programs that are longer term. So for instance, we have this program called Career Ladders, which are for 11-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and then another program called COSI Academy, which is a program for primarily high school students. But those are targeted smaller programs where we identify kids that are interested in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, and then we provide every Saturday and then 4 weeks over the summer program for them. But to your point, instead of the hundreds that we deal that way, how do we get 100,000, 12 to 17-year-olds excited? We're working on it, but it's a big problem nationally. First you, sir,
yeah.
And then you to back up.
So how are you involved in the Smart City project?
Great question. So first of all, we hope to be involved in smart cities in as large of a capacity as possible. Where they are right now, there are two efforts. There's an effort led by the city and an effort led by the partnership. And the partnership really looks at the kind of the corporate support and aspects of smart city. The city aspect is looking more at the programmatic stuff, especially around the education. We're working with both of them to be the lens of smart cities. Because again, just like vaccines or basic science research, it's hard to go into the universities and get access to the cutting edge stuff, but maybe you'll come to COSI. So in the same way, we told both the folks from the partnership and folks from the city that how can we be the lens through which the average Columbus resident or greater Columbus resident can learn about smart cities. So we're going to do everything from having some information available through our website to having small pop-up exhibits that you'll come through and you might see some technology or some signage that talks about smart cities. Ultimately, it'd be nice to build an exhibit, but that's a much bigger capital investment, so it depends how that, what started off as $60 million, which has now grown to roughly $300 million cash and then another $350 million in kind. It'll be interesting to see how that parses out, so hopefully we could have an actual state-of-the-art exhibit to show why Columbus is one of the cutting-edge cities by getting the Smart Cities grant, and particularly around transportation and the next generation of that. Yes, sir.
As you can see, there's a substantial amount of gray hair in the room. Do you have any programs specifically aimed at advanced seniors?
All jokes aside, I really thank you for that question. Short answer is yes. I can tell you, before I started, we had a program, it was called Synapse, and we're gearing it to kind of retired populations, to showing that there's really neat stuff that's happening in this kind of science and technology community that's of interest, or should be of interest to that cohort. The program didn't go so well, so we're actually in an iterative stage to try to figure out how we can tweak it to make it more accessible. But I have an expression: we want to serve everybody from the womb to the tomb. No pun intended. And so absolutely thinking about what's exciting and what's dynamic. And in this room at a CMC lecture about 4 weeks ago, we actually heard a very powerful lecture from a professor from the University of North Carolina that talked about the aging, or the graying rather, and browning of the U.S. population. The U.S. population is getting older and older and older. So absolutely, how can COSI be relevant to that population as well? But I haven't found the immortality drug, if that's what you're wondering. All right. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the word industry like twice, which is part of your name. And I think I saw one thing that said Honda. How are you involving industry to connect with the STEM education team so that these kids can see what they can do with this other than just a job?
Absolutely. And I owe this to my predecessor and the chair of the board and the great folks at COSI, because this happened before me. But I showed you the Honda, or at least logo, the Honda Meet the Innovators exhibition. This is an exhibition that opened last year, and I'm so excited about it for 3 reasons. One, to your exact point, it's called, the doing business name is called COSI, Center of Science and Industry. And and by the way, that's a common name across the country. There's the Museum of Science and Industry. There's a lot of science and industries across the country. That was in vogue in kind of the 40s and 50s. But to your point, a lot of the industry has kind of fallen off. I'm excited because the Honda exhibit actually showed us the science behind an industry, and I'm extra excited because it's not just any industry, it's an industry right here in our backyard. That's one. Two, it really excites me because the cost of exhibits is, as I mentioned earlier, very expensive. That exhibit, those of you who've seen it, it's about 6,000 square feet or 5,000 square feet. Go check it out. If you haven't seen it, it's really neat. That exhibit would have cost around $3 to $4 million and take about 5 to 6 years to develop, from the idea to it being on the floor. Exhibits traditionally take a lot of money and take a long time to develop. This was done from the concept to on the floor 18 months, but really from the time they started building it, it took 6 months, and it only cost about $250,000. Why? Because the partner Honda gave a whole lot of the resources. Almost everything you see in the exhibit was donated free from Honda. So the cost went way down. And then in terms of fabrication, their engineers worked with our developers to co-create that exhibit, which brings me to my third point. The other reason why it's so excitable is a company like Honda, you know, people know they make cars, but you don't really know what's happening in there. But yet now their engineers were able to showcase all the cool technology for an institution that brings about 650,000 people through every year. So that's really exciting. And so for me, a new person to Columbus that recognizes all the other industry folks out there, all the other great brands that are doing great things, how can we replicate that model and bring more industry stuff onto the floor at COSI? So great question. It's an exciting way of reducing costs, reducing time, and having new and refreshed content. And ultimately, again, back to the last part about your question, how do you connect it back to STEM? Well, now you have a kid from Linden or Hilltop or Bexley or New Albany or wherever that can come through that exhibit, or even a young adult, come through that exhibit, get excited and realize, wait a minute, this is a company 15 miles down the street. Maybe I can work there. And that's really cool.
It was started here. How did we get to where we got without capital markets, without borrowing money or going public?
I mean,
I think it's a great opportunity for us to expand that and use that.
absolutely. And one of the things I didn't mention, I really appreciate that question. One of the things I didn't mention is the board ambitiously had an onboarding program for me, which has been fantastic to have me meet with basically everybody. And in doing that, I've met with the presidents of Chase, of Chase JP Morgan, of Huntington, of all the banks. And what's fascinating is the way the conversation went was that they too understand exactly what you're talking about. And so what I'm looking forward to building with them are programmatic initiatives that just don't teach algebra for algebra's sake or arithmetic for arithmetic, but teach it in the context of investment banking or teach it in the context of money markets and leverage what they're great at, and again, it ties it back to reality. School shouldn't prepare you for real life. School should be real life. And so you're absolutely right. And you see it with the subprime crisis. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of interesting foul play, if you will, that happened with the companies, and we all know how that worked out. But imagine if we had a much more literate average person around how interest rates go, around how, if they just knew basic math, as much as people were excited to buy a bigger house, they would understand better and it wouldn't have been so bad. So I absolutely think science literacy was one of the contributors, or illiteracy was one of the contributors to the subprime market. But thank you for that, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Bertley. Thank you very much.